There is a category of threat that does not announce itself with a launch signature or a weapons release. It announces itself with a radar tone, the specific, distinctive sound of a fire control system that has found what it is looking for and is measuring the distance to it with the precision that precedes a decision. In the electronic warfare community, that tone is called a lock. In the operational community, it is called the beginning of a conversation that neither side wants to finish. At 9:44 p.m., the conversation began. The USS Arleigh Burke-class destroyer had been conducting a freedom of navigation transit through the northern Arabian Gulf at 17 knots, following the shipping lane corridor that ran parallel to the Iranian coastline at a distance of 22 nautical miles. 22 nautical miles was international water by every applicable legal framework, and had been confirmed as such through 3 decades of American naval operations in this waterway. It was also, as the destroyer's electronic warfare officer well understood from the pre-mission intelligence package, within the engagement range of every Iranian coastal anti-ship missile battery that had been assessed as operational in this sector. The shipping lane was legal. It was also geometrically inside the threat envelope. Both of those things were simultaneously true, and the destroyer's presence in this corridor was a deliberate expression of the legal reality in full awareness of the tactical one. The electronic warfare officer had been monitoring the Iranian shore-based radar network since the transit began at 7:30 p.m. The network was active in its normal pattern: search radars painting the Gulf at their standard intervals, fire control systems cycling through their diagnostic transmissions on the frequencies and schedules that his systems had cataloged from previous transits. Normal. Predictable. The electromagnetic equivalent of a boarder that was watching without acting. At 9:44 p.m., one element of that pattern changed. A new emission appeared on the EW Suite's passive receiver display. Not one of the cataloged fire control systems, not a frequency and pulse pattern that existed anywhere in the pre-mission threat library. A new system, or a modified system, or a system that had been present in this sector for a period of time without having been characterized by previous collection operations, which was a different problem from a new system, but arrived at the same operational consequence. The destroyer was being illuminated by a fire control radar that nobody aboard had a complete technical file on. The EW officer characterized the emission in 17 seconds. Frequency: C-band, consistent with the guidance and fire control architecture of the Chinese-manufactured C-802 anti-ship missile system and its Iranian domestically produced derivatives. Pulse repetition interval: 800 microseconds, consistent with a target tracking mode rather than a search sweep. Beam width: narrow, consistent with a system that had already completed its search phase and was now maintaining a focused track. Signal amplitude: rising steadily, consistent with the beam geometry tightening as the fire control solution developed. The fire control radar had already been in search mode before it appeared on the EW Suite's display. It had found the destroyer before the destroyer's systems had found it. Bridge EW. New contact, C-band fire control emission, bearing 268, signal in tracking mode. Non-catalogued system. Assess as coastal battery fire control, active track on this vessel. The commanding officer was on the bridge. He heard the report and felt, in the specific way that commanding officers feel things they have been trained to feel, while maintaining the professional composure that command requires, the particular weight of a fire control lock from a system he did not have a full technical file on. An unknown system meant unknown engagement range. Unknown engagement range meant the standard tactical geometry, the established safe standoff from assessed threat ranges, was a calculation that rested on data that was, at this specific moment, incomplete. He directed 4 simultaneous actions in 11 seconds. The ship's active defenses transitioned to heightened readiness posture. The electronic countermeasures suite activated its passive jamming preparation profile. The flash message to CENTCOM and 5th Fleet went out reporting the lock, the bearing, the frequency characterization, and the non-catalogued status. and the helmsman received an order to increase speed to 23 knots and alter course 4 degrees south. Not a dramatic evasion, but a measured change in the ship's speed and aspect that would alter the fire control solution's development while the larger situation resolved itself. The Iranian fire control radar adjusted. The beam shift was immediate and precise, the tracking solution updating to account for the course change in under 12 seconds. A fire control system that updates its track solution in 12 seconds following a maneuvering target's course change is not operating on stored trajectory data. It is in active, real-time tracking mode with a processing speed consistent with a modern digitally integrated radar system, rather than the analog-era equipment that the previous generation of Iranian coastal battery assessments had characterized as the sector standard. The EW officer noted the adaptation time and transmitted it to CENTCOM in his second flash report at 9:47 p.m. 12 seconds was a number. Numbers were information. Information, in the specific context of an uncharacterized threat system demonstrating its capabilities in real time against an American warship, was exactly what the intelligence community needed and exactly what the situation was involuntarily providing. At 9:48 p.m., the Rivet Joint aircraft that had been repositioned from its standard orbit to a bearing optimized for collection on the Iranian coastal sector arrived on its new station. The RC-135 had been airborne for 6 hours and had been rerouted in response to the flash message in a process that had taken 4 minutes and 23 seconds from the message transmission to the aircraft's crew receiving its new tasking. The Rivet Joint's collection systems were, in the signals intelligence community's assessment, the best organic capability in theater for characterizing an unidentified radar system under operational conditions. The conditions where the system was transmitting at full power in its active tracking mode rather than in the reduced power diagnostic cycling that made characterization difficult. An unidentified Iranian fire control radar tracking an American destroyer in real time was, from a pure signals intelligence perspective, an extraordinarily productive collection opportunity. The EW officer aboard the destroyer understood this dynamic and did not find it particularly comforting. At 9:49 p.m., the destroyer's active jamming suite transitioned from preparation posture to a limited employment mode, not full-power jamming, which would represent an escalation of the electronic engagement that current rules of engagement did not authorize, but a directed noise injection in the specific frequency band and pulse repetition interval that the Iranian radar was using, at a power level sufficient to introduce tracking error into the fire control solution, without constituting a disabling attack on the system. The distinction between degrading a fire control solution and destroying a fire control system was legal, operational, and precisely calibrated in the rules of engagement document that the EW officer had memorized. He was operating at the exact boundary of that calibration. The Iranian fire control radar's response to the jamming was immediate and demonstrated a capability that the EW officer had not expected from a system with this frequency signature. It frequency hopped, not a slow, predictable hop across a pre-programmed sequence. A rapid, pseudo-random frequency agility pattern that cycled through 17 distinct frequencies in the C-band allocation, in a pattern that the EW suite's analysis algorithm required 4.1 seconds to characterize as pseudo-random rather than sequential. 4.1 seconds during which the tracking solution was being maintained by a system that was actively adapting to the jamming environment faster than the jamming system was adapting to it. The EW officer increased jamming power at 9:50 p.m., accepting the escalation in the electronic exchange in exchange for the track degradation that increased power produced even against a frequency-hopping system. The Iranian fire control radar's signal amplitude on the EW suite's receiver, the measure of how strongly the beam was focused on the destroyer, decreased by approximately 18% over the 90 seconds following the power increase. Not defeated, degraded. The fire control solution was still being maintained. The degradation meant it was being maintained with less precision than it had been 90 seconds earlier, which was operationally meaningful and strategically insufficient. At 9:52 p.m., a second fire control radar emission appeared on the EW suite's display. Different bearing. 251, 17 degrees south of the first. Different frequency, S-band, consistent with a different system type. Same tracking mode signal characteristics, narrow beam, focused aspect toward the destroyer, amplitude consistent with an established track rather than an initial acquisition sweep. A second coastal battery at a different position on the Iranian coast in a different frequency band, maintaining a simultaneous track on the destroyer. The geometry was specific and deliberate. 2 fire control systems at different positions in different frequency bands, a configuration that forced the destroyer's jamming suite to divide its power between 2 simultaneous frequency threats in 2 different bands. A jamming system operating at full power against one threat was operating at half power against each of 2 simultaneous threats in different bands. Half power produced a proportionally smaller track degradation effect. The Iranian planners had apparently understood this arithmetic and had structured their employment to exploit it. The EW officer was now managing 2 simultaneous fire control locks from 2 non-catalogued systems in 2 different frequency bands with a single jamming suite that had a fixed total power output that divided when it spread. He reported the second lock to the commanding officer at 9:52 p.m. and 33 seconds. The commanding officer directed the SM-2 battery to transition to active engagement readiness, a status that did not authorize firing but positioned the system to complete its engagement sequence in the minimum possible time if authorization was received. He transmitted the second lock report to 5th Fleet and CENTCOM as a flash update and requested air support assets capable of SEAD employment be placed on immediate standby. He did not request SEAD employment authorization. He requested standby. The distinction was precise and intentional. At 9:54 p.m., the Rivet Joint transmitted its first characterization assessment of the first fire control system to both 5th Fleet and the destroyer simultaneously. The assessment identified the system as an Iranian, domestically produced derivative of the C-802 guidance architecture operating with a digital signal processing upgrade that had not been previously documented in operational collection. The upgrade produced the frequency hopping capability the EW officer had been contending with since 9:50 p.m. The Rivet Joint's characterization also included, in the technical annex of the transmission, the specific frequency sequence parameters of the pseudo-random hopping pattern, a 47-frequency pseudo-random sequence cycling at approximately 2,000 hops per second. The EW officer read the frequency sequence parameters from the Rivet Joint's transmission and had his system's adaptive algorithm updated with the sequence at 9:55 p.m. A jamming system that knows the pseudo-random sequence is not contending with pseudo-random jamming resistance. It is contending with a predictable sequence that it can preposition its jamming energy against, effectively converting a frequency hopping problem back into a fixed frequency problem. The update was operationally significant. At 9:56 p.m., the EW officer applied the updated algorithm to the first fire control system's jamming response. The first fire control system's signal amplitude on the EW suite's receiver dropped 61% in 14 seconds. The track solution had not been destroyed. The system was still transmitting, still in tracking mode, still maintaining some version of a fire control picture. But a 61% amplitude reduction at the receiver meant a 61% reduction in the effective aperture of the fire control solution's precision. At this range, a 61% reduction in tracking precision did not mean the coastal battery could not fire. It meant that if it fired with the degraded solution it currently had, the probability of its missile arriving where the destroyer was going to be, rather than where the fire control solution currently said the destroyer was substantially reduced. Substantially reduced was not zero. The EW officer was not under the impression that his work had made the destroyer safe. He was under the impression that he had made it safer by a specific, measurable amount that happened to require another fire control system in a different frequency band to complete the Iranian battery's operational picture. The Rivet Joint was characterizing the second system. At 9:57 p.m., the second fire control system's S-band emission underwent a change that the Rivet Joint detected before the destroyer's own EW suite resolved it at its distance. The S-band system's pulse repetition interval compressed, a change consistent with the fire control sequence transitioning from target tracking to engagement phase initialization. Not launch. The step before launch, where the guidance system confirms its solution and the battery awaits the final authorization to commit the missile. The Rivet Joint transmitted the assessment at 9:57 p.m. and 8 seconds. Track update: S-band emitter, bearing 251. PRF compression consistent with pre-launch engagement phase. Assess system in final solution verification mode. The commanding officer received the assessment and made his call to 5th Fleet at 9:57 p.m. and 22 seconds. His voice on the encrypted net was level and precise. 5th Fleet, this is ship call sign. 2nd Coastal Battery, bearing 251 assessed in pre-launch engagement phase. Request immediate SEAD authorization, bearing 251. Time critical. The authorization came at 9:57 p.m. and 41 seconds. 19 seconds of staffing for a time-critical request from a commanding officer who had 2 fire control systems tracking his ship, and one of them in pre-launch mode. The F/A-18F section that had been placed on sea to standby at the carrier 64 nautical miles southeast was airborne within 40 seconds of the authorization transmission reaching the carrier. 2 aircraft, one each carrying an AGM-88 HARM configured for pre-briefed mode, a mode in which the missile's seeker head is programmed with the target radar's frequency and pulse characteristics before launch, allowing employment from beyond the radar's own detection range. The pre-briefed parameters for the second system were being transmitted to the aircraft's systems from the Rivet Joint's characterization data as the FA-18Fs climbed and accelerated northwest. At 9:58 p.m., the second fire control system's PRF returned to tracking mode, not from launch. Not because it had fired. The PRF decompressed from engagement initialization back to the sustained track pulse rate that characterized targeting mode. The system had been in pre-launch engagement phase for approximately 50 seconds and had returned to tracking mode without committing to a launch. The EW officer noted the PRF change and reported it to the commanding officer in 4 seconds. The first fire control system, the C-band system that the EW officer had degraded to 39% of its original tracking precision, altered its beam geometry at 9:58 p.m. and 30 seconds. The amplitude at the receiver decreased further, not because the jamming had increased, but because the beam had shifted. Not off the destroyer. Shifted to a wider scan mode that covered a larger azimuth, consistent with a system that had lost sufficient confidence in its tracked solution to shift from narrow, focused tracking to a broader search and reacquire posture. The fire control solution on the first system had degraded past the point where the battery's operators found it usable. They had shifted to reacquisition mode. Both fire control systems were now in modes that were not pre-launch engagement initialization. The C-band system was reacquiring. The S-band system had stepped back from pre-launch to tracking. Neither system had fired. Neither system was in the immediate posture that had existed at 9:57 p.m. The F/A-18F section was at 39 nautical miles from the second battery's assessed position. HARM pre-briefed, weapons-free authorization active. Their own radar warning receivers confirming the S-band emission at reduced amplitude consistent with the tracking mode the Rivet Joint had reported. The flight lead checked his engagement geometry at 9:59 p.m. The S-band system was in tracking mode, not pre-launch. The weapons-free authorization was active. The engagement geometry was inside the HARM's employment envelope. The HARM would find the S-band radar whether the radar was in pre-launch mode or tracking mode. The seeker did not distinguish between modes, only between transmitting and not transmitting. He transmitted to the CAOC at 9:59 p.m. and 12 seconds. CAOC Devil Section. Second emitter is in tracking mode, not pre-launch. Authorization is active. Request confirmation to employ or hold. The CAOC response came at 9:59 p.m. and 31 seconds. Devil Section CAOC. Hold. Emitter not in pre-launch. Hold harm employment. Maintain standby posture. The flight lead acknowledged and held his position at 37 nautical miles, circling, harm ready, the S-band emission steady in his warning receivers in its tracking mode signature. At 10:01 p.m., the C-band system's reacquisition sweep found the destroyer and returned to narrow tracking mode. The amplitude on the destroyer's receiver was lower than it had been at 9:44 p.m. The jamming algorithm update was maintaining its effectiveness, but the system was tracking again. The fire control solution was being rebuilt. At 10:03 p.m., the S-band system's PRF compressed again. 7 seconds of pre-launch engagement phase initialization. The Rivet Joint transmitted the assessment at 10:03 p.m. and 4 seconds. The commanding officer transmitted to the CAOC at 10:03 p.m. and 9 seconds. The authorization came at 10:03 p.m. and 22 seconds. The flight lead committed the first harm at 10:03 p.m. and 28 seconds. The missile departed the rail and homed on the S-band emission source on the Iranian coastline, 51 nautical miles from its launch point, with a flight time of approximately 78 seconds at this range and employment altitude. At 10:03 p.m. and 39 seconds, 11 seconds after the harm launch, the S-band fire control emission ceased. Complete cessation. The operators had detected the harm seeker or had seen the launch through their own surveillance systems and had shut down to deny the missile's homing signal. The harm transitioned to inertial guidance mode, navigating toward the last known coordinates of the emitter. The harm impacted at 10:04 p.m. and 46 seconds. The Rivet Joint's collection system confirmed the impact through the cessation of all associated electronic emissions from the target area. Not just the fire control radar, but the associated search radar and communication systems that had been collocated with the battery. The impact had affected the battery's entire electronic infrastructure, not only the fire control antenna. Satellite imagery confirmation came 47 minutes later. Structural damage to the radar facility consistent with a direct fragmentation hit on the antenna assembly and associated electronics housing. The mobile launcher vehicles associated with the battery had dispersed before the impact. The radar facility had not dispersed. The C-band system ceased transmitting at 10:04 p.m. and 53 seconds, 7 seconds after the harm impact on the second battery. Whether the C-band battery had shut down in response to the harm impact on its partner, had received a command from the Iranian Coastal Defense Command to stand down, or had made its own assessment of the situation and acted on it, the Rivet Joint's collection system could not determine from the electronic picture alone. The emission was gone. The lock on the destroyer was gone. The fire control conversation that had begun at 9:44 p.m. was over. Total duration from first lock to final emission cessation, 20 minutes and 9 seconds. The destroyer maintained its course and speed through the cessation and for 40 minutes afterward, until the transit corridor brought it south of the sector where the Iranian coastal battery network was assessed to maintain operational coverage. The EW officer maintained his active jamming profile in the C-band and S-band allocations for the full 40 minutes. The FA-18F section held their CAD standby posture for the same period before the CAOC stood them down and they returned to the carrier. The accounting in the after-action report was conducted with the precision that the situation warranted and the clarity that the situation demanded. E1 AGM-88 harm expended. 1 Iranian coastal radar facility assessed as structurally damaged. Primary fire control antenna and electronics destroyed. Associated systems disabled. One Iranian fire control system, the C-band system, self-terminated without being directly engaged. Total harm expenditure: 1 round at a cost of approximately $284,000. 0 damage to the destroyer. 0 personnel casualties. Freedom of navigation transit completed on planned route and schedule. HIC intelligence value of the 20 minutes of engagement, assessed as exceptional. The Rivet Joint had captured complete operational emission profiles on 2 non-catalogued Iranian coastal defense systems operating under full power, active tracking conditions against a maneuvering target. The C-band system's pseudo-random frequency hopping sequence had been characterized and would be incorporated into the fleet's EW update package within 72 hours. The S-band system's pre-launch engagement phase emission characteristics, the PRF compression sequence and timing that had twice triggered the SED authorization chain, had been documented with precision that no previous collection operation had achieved against this system type. The Iranian Coastal Defense Command had, in attempting to hold an American destroyer at fire control lock for 20 minutes, provided the electronic warfare community with the most complete operational characterization of 2 of its most advanced coastal missile system variants that American signals intelligence had ever collected. The EW officer wrote that finding in the technical section of the after-action report in neutral, factual language that carried no editorial weight and needed none. He was a professional. His job was to document what had happened and what it meant, in language precise enough to be useful to the people who would act on it. He completed the report at 1:30 a.m. He had been on watch for 12 hours. He submitted it to the intelligence processing queue, secured his station, and walked out to the destroyer's weather deck to stand in the warm Gulf air for a few minutes before going below. The Iranian coastline was a dark line on the northern horizon, 11 miles farther away than it had been when the transit began. He stood there for a while. The Gulf was flat and warm and carrying its particular smell of petroleum and salt and the residual heat of a day that was already becoming a night that was already becoming a morning. 20 minutes. 2 fire control locks. 1 harm. 1 radar facility. 1 data set that would change how every ship in the 5th Fleet prepared for this exact threat on every subsequent transit. The line runs through water that has no interest in where it falls. It is maintained by the people who know exactly where it falls and who go back to it, transit after transit at 17 knots, in the specific and unglamorous knowledge that being there is the entire point. The Gulf does not remember the emissions. The EW suite does. That is why the transit is made, and that is why it will be made again.